Cult That Kills. Chapter 7. Rod Ferrell was a pale, skinny, stringy-haired high school dropout from a troubled family who sliced his arms, carved a demonic symbol on his chest, and found community through his assumed identity as a 500-year-old vampire. Heather Wendorf roamed the hallways of her Florida high school in long black clothes, a Barbie doll hanging from a noose off of her backpack. She insisted to her boyfriends that the best sex you could have happened after drinking blood. The two met in 1995 when they were both living in Eustis, Florida, a small city of about 15,000 known as America's hometown, 30 miles north of Orlando. They shared an interest in the undead and dated for a spell. In December 1995, after Ferrell's mother discovered Rod and 3 other teens covered in blood in his bedroom, she moved him back to her hometown of Murray, Kentucky, one of many moves they made between the two states during Rod's young life. But Ferrell and Wendorf continued to keep in touch, and Heather's $80 a month long-distance phone bills became a point of contention between her and her parents. Over 7 months in 1996, Wendorf apparently told Ferrell that her parents were hurting her. Ferrell decided to travel to Florida to rescue Wendorf, and then head to Louisiana. Along for the ride in the red Buick Skylark were his fellow vampire friends and members of his supposed cult, the Vampire Clan. They were Howard Scott Anderson, 16, Dana Cooper, 19, and Charity Kesey, 16, who wanted a clean start far away from Murray. By Thanksgiving, Wendorf and Ferrell's lives would be irrevocably intertwined, and not just because of the crossing over vampire ceremony that Rod, then 16, performed on Heather, 15, in Eustis's Greenwood Cemetery. By the time the Vampire Clan left town, Heather's parents, Richard and Ruth Wendorf, had been bludgeoned to death with a crowbar, with a combined 50 wounds on their bodies. And, unlike their vampire assassins, they had no hope of coming back to life under the cover of darkness. Vintage vampires. Unlike some of the more modern cults that claim to receive messages from God through alien encounters, the claim of vampires roaming America, as well as the rest of the world, has a much longer history. Many ancient civilizations feared some sort of blood-sucking demon, and our modern notion of the vampire can be traced back to 10th-century Slavic regions of Europe. New World settlers eventually brought this superstition with them across the Atlantic. By the 19th century, tuberculosis, then known as consumption and sometimes referred to as the White Plague, had killed 1 in 7 people who had ever lived. In an era before the discovery that the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria was easily spread through the air, some superstitious New Englanders blamed vampires when people around them became pale, fatigued, coughed up blood, and slowly withered away. Concerned family members took matters into their own hands in hopes of curing their loved ones. In the simplest cases, suspected vampires were dug up and flipped upside down in their coffin, while other methods included breaking open the chest cavity to remove the heart, burning it, and then feeding the ashes to the afflicted. Vampire exhumations might have been clandestine, lantern-lit affairs, attended by a few family members, doctors, or clergy, or public and festive gatherings worthy of front-page newspaper stories, according to a Smithsonian Magazine article written by Abigail Tucker. Tucker retells a 1793 heartburning ceremony in Manchester, New Hampshire, as described in the town's history. Timothy Mead officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the then-living wife of Captain Burton. It was the month of February and good slaying. The last suspected vampire known to be unearthed in the United States was Mercy Lena Brown, a 19-year-old who died in Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892. Mercy grew up in a farming family and was preceded in death by her mother, Mary, and her eldest sister, Mary Olive, both of whom died in 1883. Mercy and her brother Edwin contracted tuberculosis in 1891. Though the much-feared disease was ravaging communities both large and small, the Brown family was particularly affected. In hopes of preserving the family bloodline, a dozen Browns convinced Mercy's father to unearth his wife and 2 daughters. Mary and Mary Olive had died nearly a decade earlier and their bodies were found decomposed as expected. Mercy, however, had been dead for just 2 months and interred in an above-ground crypt for the winter. She was found in good condition with blood still in her heart and lungs. According to family lore, she had flipped over in her tomb, possible evidence that she had been buried alive, though interpreted as another indicator of vampirism. Mercy was the Brown family's one and only vampire suspect. In hopes that Edwin would live, Mercy's heart and liver were torn out and burned right there in the cemetery, not too far from the family markers, as the local medical examiner looked on. Her ashes were mixed with water and given to her brother to drink. He died 2 months later. According to Food for the Dead, on the trail of New England's vampires, by the morning of March 19, 1892, the Brown family went 19th century viral, with the front page of the Providence Journal declaring, "Bodies of dead relatives taken from their graves." According to New England historian Robert Bell, these appalling acts of digging up a family member and removing their organs and muscles were actually a sign of devotion in rural communities in the time before modern medicine. They were an outward display that you are doing everything you can to fix the problem, as he told Tucker. In Vampires, Burial, and Death, Paul Barber writes that vampiric practices were used throughout world history as a way for people to understand death, especially in ages and places where people didn't have access to sophisticated medical knowledge or research. Our sources, in Europe as elsewhere, show a remarkable unanimity on this point. The dead may bring us death, Barber writes. To prevent this we must lay them to rest properly, propitiate them, and, when all else fails, kill them a second time. What was left of Mercy Brown's remains were buried in the family plot at the small Chestnut Hill Cemetery, which sits behind the Baptist Church of Exeter, just a few miles off Interstate 95. Her grave has become something of a dark tourist destination. In August 1996, the headstone disappeared and was mysteriously returned a week later. These days, a metal band holds the headstone in place and police keep an eye on the cemetery on Halloween. Vampire enthusiasts have been known to leave plastic fangs on the marker in solidarity, and in 2011, 2 Rhode Island teens died in a car crash after a trip to check out Brown's grave by moonlight. Real vampire culture. Rod Ferrell and his friends, who spent their fair share of time in cemeteries, look to the fictional and fringe real vampire culture that evolved out of punk and goth culture in the 1970s. According to researchers Megan White and Hatem Omar, real vampire behavior can include wearing prosthetic fangs, sleeping in a coffin, consuming blood, and only going outside at night, and the culture is believed to have evolved from role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and popular culture portrayals of the undead, such as Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series. These real vampires differ from clinical vampires, who believe they have a physical need to consume blood, and may get a sexual thrill from doing so. White and Omar write that adolescents are naturally searching for identity and social bonding, and vampire cult activities, such as drinking blood, can serve as a way for otherwise disconnected teens to have intimate and empowering experiences. There's also the sexy and sensitive appeal of modern vampires, as portrayed in recent decades by Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, but date back to the folkloric age when vampires were being disinterred, seemingly with erections, though this was likely just bloating in the nether regions from decomposing organs. Rod Ferrell and his friends found community through their local vampire cult, which was believed to have about 30 to 40 members who engaged in group sex, drugs, and violent and ritualized cult behavior. Law enforcement sources, as well as New York's Vampire Research Center, noted an increase in vampire activities after interview with a vampire hit movie theaters in 1994, and Ferrell also seemed to be inspired by the flick. According to an article in The Independent written by Daniel Jeffries, Ferrell owed $30 in late fines for the movie rental, was caught surfing vampire material at his local library, and had pursued changing his name to Lestat after Rice's antihero. Ferrell, who would later boast in interviews that his charisma helped him start a vampire cult, and whose grandfather believed he had the makings of a great spiritual leader, became an active member of Murray's vampire scene. A frequent hangout was the skeleton of a luxurious and long-abandoned lake house that the crew called the Vampire Hotel. Locals, including Ferrell's own mother, gathered at the spot, which was littered with beer cans and spray-painted with occult symbols, to drink blood, perform rituals, and have sex by candlelight. Ferrell officially became a vampire with the help of then-best friend Stephen Jaden Murphy, through a vampire initiation ceremony known as crossing over. In a graveyard at night, Ferrell and Murphy drank each other's blood, with Murphy giving Ferrell a new, vampire name, Visago. Ferrell and future co-defendant Howard Scott Anderson were also active in the Victorian Age Masquerade Performance Society or VAMPS. A vampire role-playing group started in 1995 by a Murray State student named James Yohe. Eventually, Ferrell would become more interested in living as a vampire than pretending to be one. Yohe would later tell the Ledger that VAMPS was about improv, not bloodsucking. People, no matter what, are always going to find a scapegoat, and I don't want VAMPS to be that. We started out as a positive influence, Yohe told in the Ledger. Shortly after the murders, America's Most Wanted warned parents of the dangers of vampire role-playing that could lead young people to the dark side. The Road to Eustace. Rod Ferrell was on law enforcement's radar for months before he drove to Florida and bashed in the Wendorf skulls. During the summer that led up to the murders, Ferrell's mother Sandra Gibson turned to Kentucky Social Services in hopes of getting her son, who had dropped out of school, was cutting himself, and using cocaine, heroin, and other hard drugs, back to reality, or at least a manageable state. Gibson told social workers that she'd seen Rod and his girlfriend drinking blood, and that Rod believed he was possessed. And Gibson had plenty of her own issues. In addition to her own satanic practices and trying to seduce boys who were her son's age, Gibson believed that demons had taken up residence outside her second-floor apartment window. On November 25, the same day that Vampire Clan arrived in Eustace, Ferrell was supposed to stand before a Kentucky judge and explain why he hadn't written a 2-page paper ordered by the court on the detrimental effects of drugs, the occult, and defiant behavior. And then there were the animals. In October, Ferrell and another teen broke into the Murray-Callaway County Animal Shelter, torturing and killing 2 puppies, and beating 50 other dogs after letting them out of their kennels. They also trampled grass on the property in some sort of ritual act. WKMS reporter John Null reported on what Sheriff Stan Scott said at the time, "We're dealing with some sick individuals and I want them caught. This goes way beyond a simple breaking and entering. One of these animals was stomped to death and the other had its legs either pulled or cut off. This is a case of absolute vandalism and these people need to be caught." By early November, officials were preparing to arrest Ferrell and his accomplice on charges of animal cruelty and burglary. After the Wendorf murders, others, including ex-best friend Murphy, recalled Ferrell being abusive toward animals, including one time when he hurled a cat against a tree, killing his pet in a fit of rage that seemingly came out of nowhere. Researchers have long suspected a link between animal cruelty and criminal tendencies. Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was fascinated with animal corpses from an early age. In their 2003 book, Animal Cruelty: Pathway to Violence Against People, University of South Florida professor Kathleen Heide and animal activist Linda Mersperez found in a study of 45 violent inmates in Florida prisons, half had abused animals when they were children. By comparison, 20% of nonviolent criminals had participated in animal cruelty in their younger years. A lot of people who want to victimize, they want to start with something they can really control, Mersperez told the Associated Press. The easiest thing in the world to control is a puppy. It's a matter of escalation, they work their way up. Ferrell's mother, however, said there was no way he could have hurt all those dogs. Rod would never do that to an animal, Gibson told the Orlando Sentinel in 1998. He had a little kitten that slept with him. He let that little kitten crawl all over him. He was at home asleep when that happened, she said, referring to the Murray-Callaway County Animal Shelter break-in and slaughter. I wanted them alive. With Kentucky and the pending animal abuse charges in his rearview mirror, Ferrell set off with Howard Scott Anderson, vampire alias Nosferatu, Dana Cooper, who had frequented Murray's Vampire Hotel, and Charity Kesey, Ferrell's pregnant girlfriend. The ride started out fun and upbeat, but the tension grew thicker as they continued south. Ferrell told the others that he had to pick up Wendorf, whom he referred to as Zoe, before continuing on to New Orleans, a vampire-friendly city where real vampires lived together in communities and engaged in philanthropic activities, such as feeding the homeless, in addition to blood-drinking rituals. The crew rolled into Eustis on Monday, November 25, 3 days before Thanksgiving, with Rod only giving Heather a 24-hour heads-up. The following day, she skipped her AP art history class to meet Ferrell and his friends at Walmart to buy razors and then went to Greenwood Cemetery, just a few blocks away from Eustis High School. At the cemetery, Ferrell started crossing over Heather. They both partook in ceremonial drinking of the other's blood, and according to Wendorf, Ferrell was her sire. The person that gets crossed over is like subject to whatever the sire wants, Wendorf would later say in a deposition. Like the sire is boss basically. They have authority over you. The vampire cult also had to find a way to get Wendorf out of Eustis. One member offered up a possible scenario: tie up Richard and Ruth and knock them unconscious, making it appear that Heather had been abducted. No. Wendorf later told police was her response to that plan. I remember telling him flat out, don't even go near my parents, I wanted them alive, Wendorf claimed. Rod went crazy. If you believe Rod Ferrell, he walked into 24135, Green Tree Lane just planning to rob and hog-tie the Wendorfs, maybe rough them up a bit if they put up a fight, and then hit the road. If you believe the other teens swept up by Ferrell's charisma, the self-proclaimed vampire king talked with Heather about his plan to take out the Wendorfs in the hours leading up to their murders. No matter whose version you believe, Ferrell and Anderson entered the Wendorf residence through the garage, with Rod scooping up a crowbar before accessing the home through the unlocked garage door. Richard Wendorf, a 49-year-old manager at a metal manufacturing company, was asleep on the couch in front of a blaring television, his shoes kicked off. According to the Orlando Sentinel, the sound of running water let them know that Ruth Wendorf, a 54-year-old stay-at-home mother and school volunteer who loved crafting, gardening, and taking care of her chickens, was in the shower. And then, as Anderson would later put it, Rod went crazy. Fuck it, Ferrell thought, standing above his sleeping prey. He raised up the crowbar and brought it down on Richard Wendorf's face, neck, and chest more than 20 times, smashing his glasses and rendering his flesh the consistency of raw hamburger meat. Richard was pounded into his couch, with a thick blood stain forming on the cushions behind his head. After 20 agonizing minutes, Wendorf stopped shaking and succumbed to his injuries. A V mark was burned into his body, surrounded by circular marks that represented each member of Ferrell's clan. Hearing the commotion, Ruth Wendorf came out of the shower, barefoot and dressed in a blue nightgown, and made her way to the kitchen, where she armed herself with a hot cup of coffee. When Ferrell appeared, Ruth lunged at her husband's murderer, dousing him with the scalding liquid and scratching his face with her fingernails. Ferrell later claimed that he was planning on letting Heather's mother live, but that her offensive maneuver sent him into a murderous rage. "She clawed me, spilled fucking scalding hot coffee on me, pissed me off, so I made sure she was dead," Rod later said in a confession to law enforcement. Ferrell started hitting Ruth Wendorf repeatedly with the crowbar until he saw her brains coming out of a hole in the back of her head. The only consolation is that Ruth Wendorf did not suffer for as long as her husband, because her brain stem was severed. She likely died within a minute of Ferrell's attack. All the while, Anderson looked on, though Ferrell claims he was an active accomplice who danced with him around Richard Wendorf as he slept on the couch. Before fleeing, Ferrell and Anderson collected a few possessions as requested by Heather, then slipped out of the now-silent home with the keys to the Explorer and Richard Wendorf's Discover car. Jennifer Wendorf, 17, was working late at her cashier job at public supermarkets while her parents were being murdered. The Eustis High cheerleader arrived home just after 10:30 p.m. and didn't look twice at her father, who appeared to have fallen asleep on the couch. As she turned the corner to grab a snack in the kitchen, Jennifer spotted a trail of blood. Then she saw her mother's body, face down, the back of her skull bloody and gaping open. Jennifer ran back into the living room to rouse her father to get help. Only then did she realize that he wasn't asleep after all. The house phone had been ripped out of the wall, so she used her cell phone to call 911. "I need 2 ambulances," Jennifer Wendorf told the dispatcher. "My mother and my father have just been killed. I just walked in the door. I don't know what happened. They are dead." Jennifer had no idea if the assailants were still in the home but did know that 2 things were missing: her parents' blue 1993 Ford Explorer, and her younger sister Heather. Responding officers searched the Wendorf home with their guns drawn, turning up neither the attackers nor the teenager. No one knew if Heather was lying dead somewhere else, or kidnapped, or worse, a homicidal accomplice. A "Be on the lookout" bolo was issued for the Explorer, and a nationwide manhunt began. Heading west, Ferrell and Anderson ditched the Buick, swapping the license plates with the SUV, a critical error that would quickly link the vampire clan to the Wendorfs as soon as police ran the abandoned car's plates. Ferrell was still wearing a bloody t-shirt when he and Anderson picked up Heather and the girls and hit the road for Louisiana. Along the way, they burned their clothes and scrubbed their boots with steel wool pads in hopes of erasing all traces of the Wendorf's blood. They hung on to the blood-caked murder weapon, using it to break into a house to steal $20 in change from a piggy bank for gas money that got them to Baton Rouge. Law enforcement believe the crowbar was eventually thrown into the Mississippi. "The 3 days we were on the run, it was an utter rush. I loved that, because I knew every cop in the nation was looking for me," Ferrell recalled in the documentary The Vampire Murders, of those days on the lam. "The only hard part was keeping the other 4 in line." Somewhere along the way, Heather learned that her parents had been killed. She later stated that she stayed with the group out of fear. If Ferrell took out her parents, what might he have had in store for her if she turned on him? Back in Lake County, detectives were learning more about Rod Ferrell from Janine LeClaire, another one of his ex-girlfriends who had been planning to run away with them but was stopped by her mother. Charity Kesey was the first to crack and call her family. The calls helped Kentucky and Louisiana law enforcement narrow down their location and track the clan down at a Howard Johnson's hotel. Officers were waiting when the Ford Explorer, driven by Heather Wendorf, pulled into the motel parking lot on Thanksgiving Day morning. If responding officer James Wellborn didn't know who was running the show before, it was clear from his first encounter who was boss of the teens. From my observations, Ferrell appeared to be the one in control, the one the others looked to for guidance because they were scared. In fact, Rod Ferrell was intimidating. That was one reason I called for backup, he was reported to say in the book Blood and Lust. The other 4 teens were cooperative and subdued. The group was separated, Ferrell and Anderson in the back of one patrol car and Wendorf, Cooper, and Kesey in the other. Back at the station, there was legal red tape to cut before law enforcement could question the suspects. State law in Louisiana mandates that a parent or guardian be present when a minor is questioned, which is not required in Florida. After a call to Lake County, where a state attorney assured them that Florida had jurisdiction, Ferrell was read his Miranda rights and Louisiana detectives start asking him what happened back in Eustis. Over several hours, Ferrell told detectives that he was the guardian of the Kentucky vampire clan, and that he was first introduced to vampirism by his grandfather, witnessing a sacrifice when he was just 6 years old. Harold Gibson, Ferrell's grandfather, would later deny these claims in an Orlando Sentinel article, calling upon his Pentecostal faith. "There hasn't been any drinking, tobacco, or abusive language in our house since 1958, Gibson said. If there was vampirism, it wasn't going on in our house. Ferrell told detectives that, if you take a life, you become a god for a split second. I actually kind of felt that way for a minute. In a 1999 appeal, Ferrell and his attorneys said this was a tainted confession pulled out of a sleep-deprived teen who only wanted to see his pregnant girlfriend. Leading up to trial, the vampire clan was extradited back to Florida. On December 16, 1996, Anderson, Cooper, and Kesey were indicted by a grand jury on charges of principal to first-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed burglary. The following day, Rod Ferrell was hit with a first-degree murder indictment and pleaded not guilty. Heather Wendorf was released from a juvenile center after a grand jury cleared her of any involvement in her parents' death, though an unsealed affidavit would later reveal that Heather had asked her sister Jennifer if she had ever thought of killing their parents, and, if she wanted someone killed, Rod Ferrell would be the person for the job. Ferrell and the teen co-defendants remained in the media spotlight for years. But the main cast, as well as the supporting characters, didn't make it easy for them to fade into morbid obscurity. Ferrell was a cocky showman in court hearings, flicking his tongue at news cameras, kissing the glass door panels, and boasting to guards that they were too stupid to prevent him from taking hostages and busting out of jail. Anderson was received as a celebrity at the Lake County Jail, with inmates gathering outside his cell door when he first arrived. But his vampire antics, which included sitting crouched in a gargoyle stance for hours and gnawing on the bars, wore on his former fans, who took to throwing cold water on Anderson while he slept. Charity Kesey and another woman were caught licking or kissing blood out of cuts inflicted by a Bic razor. Back in Kentucky, Ferrell's mother was arrested after sending lurid letters to a 14-year-old that she wanted to cross her over. "I long to be near you, for your embrace. Yes, to become a vampire, a part of the family, immortal and truly yours forever," Gibson wrote in the note, which her lawyer unsuccessfully argued was protected speech. Gibson was spared the maximum sentence of a decade in prison for the felony, pleading guilty but mentally ill to first-degree criminal attempt to commit an unlawful transaction with a minor. She received probation and was mandated by the court to attend counseling. Dodging O.L. Sparky. With jurors selected and his trial set to begin, Ferrell had an unexpected announcement to make in court: he was going to plead guilty to the murders. Since Ferrell was facing the death penalty, the 12 jurors were still tasked with deciding if he would get life in prison or die for his crimes during the penalty phase of the trial. During proceedings, it was established that Ferrell was under extreme mental and physical distress when he killed the Wendorfs, possibly taking up to 8 hits of LSD that day. 2 defense psychologists testified that Ferrell came from an extremely dysfunctional family and that he had schizotypal personality disorder, which usually leads to odd or eccentric behavior, the inability to cultivate close relationships, and difficulty understanding how personal behavior might affect others. Ferrell had a lifetime of pent-up rage spurred by a dysfunctional family that did not provide him with the emotional support he needed, and had confused fantasy with reality, said psychologist Elizabeth McMahon. Despite Ferrell not showing any remorse for the murders, McMahon told the court that he might have a chance to be rehabilitated if he were to live in a structured environment. According to State Attorney Brad King, Ferrell wasn't so out of his mind. He was capable enough to sneak into the Wendorf's home after almost mistakenly entering a neighbor's house, switch the license plates, and get rid of the crowbar. After deliberating, the jurors unanimously agreed that Rod Ferrell should die for the murders of Richard and Ruth Wendorf. Age 17 at the time of the crime, he is the youngest person sentenced to O.L. Sparky, the nickname given to Florida's electric chair. After O.L., Sparky was blamed for several less-than-seamless executions in the 1990s, including a prisoner's face mask catching on fire and flames shooting out of another man's head. The electric chair was retired in favor of lethal injection. O.L. Sparky still remains an option for Florida inmates. And death row inmate Wayne Doty, who was sentenced to death after he strangled and repeatedly stabbed a fellow inmate at Florida State Prison, was the first to express his preference to die by electrocution in 2015. He remains on death row. "I think you are a disturbed young man. I think your family failed you. I think society failed you," Circuit Judge Jerry Lockett said at the sentencing, adding that Ferrell's mother ought to face charges as well. Lockett also asked state prosecutors to convene a second grand jury to look at new evidence against Heather Wendorf. Ferrell didn't seem to mind being on death row. In a prison interview, he romantically reflected on his future execution, saying that it had always been a dream of his to get the electric chair, and that he had been fantasizing about his own death since he was 9 years old. Even though he told the court that he froze during the slayings and was a fearful onlooker, not a participant, Anderson took a plea deal and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. "This is a lot better than what Ferrell got," Anderson told Orlando Sentinel reporter Frank Stanfield. In fact, none of the co-defendants went to trial. Dana Cooper, the only adult at the time of the murders and Louisiana joyride, pleaded guilty to charges of principal to third-degree murder, armed robbery, and armed burglary, and was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. Final co-defendant Charity Kesey also took a deal and was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison in August 1998. In December 1998, 2 years after the teens had been arrested in Baton Rouge, a second grand jury was convened to decide whether or not Heather Wendorf should stand for charges related to her parents' murders. Even though the local sheriff, circuit judge, and others were convinced she was involved, as well as a pair of witnesses who testified that Wendorf had talked about wanting her parents dead, she was cleared a second time. For what his word is worth, Ferrell, and his family, maintain that Heather ordered the murders. And Ferrell told daytime talk show host Maury Povich, but not the grand jury, that Wendorf was to blame for the whole thing. In an opinion piece that ran in the Orlando Sentinel a year before the second grand jury's findings, staff writer Ramsey Campbell argued that Ferrell was far easier to convict than Wendorf. How could she be a member of this vampire cult, run away with them the night of the murders, and not be charged with something? Campbell wrote, "The answer is simple. She was inconvenient to the prosecution. It would be hard to convince any jury, especially in the South, that a white middle-class girl of 16 would be capable of participating, even indirectly, in her parents' killings." The Vampire Clan today. In 2000, the Florida Supreme Court commuted Ferrell's death sentence to life in prison after ruling that a defendant must be 17 or older at the time of the offense to be eligible for capital punishment. There is a chance that both Ferrell and Anderson will walk out of prison one day, as their cases will be reheard by a judge in 2018 for possible resentencing. Ferrell's mother Sandra Gibson now goes by Star. She lives in Central Florida and is optimistic about Rod Ferrell's prospects of a reduced sentence. Charity Kesey was released from prison in March 2006 and Dana Cooper got out in October 2011. Prison release records show that both women returned to their hometown of Murray, Kentucky. Though legally in the clear, Heather Wendorf's family relationships were strained following the murders. She fell out with her grandmother, Gertrude Adams, after the elder woman fired a pistol in the air to get Wendorf to stop screaming. Things didn't improve, especially after Wendorf signed an exclusive deal to tell her story to true crime writer Aphrodite Jones. Heather completed high school while living with one of her attorneys, who was appointed her foster parent, and went on to study at the North Carolina School of the Arts. In 2006, Wendorf was still living in North Carolina and had recently married a film director. She remained distant from her family and friends but had reconnected with many family members when she attended her grandmother's funeral 3 years earlier. She reflected on her childhood as almost perfect and her fleeting interest in vampirism as something special in your life that you felt secret about. Still, the weight of her past weighs on. It's hard not to feel guilty when every news station in America is telling you you're guilty, Wendorf told the Orlando Sentinel.